Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Alwaleed Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown to a book discussion on an absolutely needed and fascinating book, The Sea in the Mediterranean World. I want to introduce first the three authors, then they'll do their presentation, and then we'll have some questions. I may raise some, but also we strongly encourage your participation. The first author I'd like to introduce is Mark Meyerson. He's professor in the Department of History and the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto. Among his publications are Muslims of Valencia in the Age of Ferdinando and Isabel, Between Coexistence and Crusade. And then A Great Effusion of Blood, Interpreting Medieval Violence. And finally, there are many books for each of these authors, I'm just selecting a few, Jews in an Iberian Frontier Kingdom, Society, Economy, and Politics. Our second speaker will be Thomas Burman. He is Robert Conway Director of the Middle East Institute and Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. His scholarly work focuses on the intellectual, cultural, and religious interactions between medieval Christians and Muslims in the Western Mediterranean. His first book, Religious Polemic and the Intellectual History of the Mozart Arabs, examined the learned culture of the Arabic-speaking Christians of Islamic Spain. And then a next book, Reading the Quran in Latin Christendom, 1140 to 1560, traced the reactions of medieval and early modern Europeans to Islam's holy book, whether they read it in Latin translation or the Arabic original. And our third author, Brian Alvarez Catlos, is professor of religious studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and research associate in humanities at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His work centers on Muslim-Christian-Jewish relations and ethno-religious identity in medieval Europe and the Islamic world, and the history of the pre-modern Mediterranean. In addition to many articles, he has written The Victors and the Vanquished, Christians and Muslims in Catalonia and Aragon, and Infidel Kings and Unholy Warriors, Power, Faith, and Violence in the Age of Crusade. We'll begin with Dr. Meyerson.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to discuss this textbook and accompanying source book that the three of us have put together. I think the question of what brought me to this project and then why we think this is was a good thing to do. I guess what brought me to this project was my interest in Christian-Muslim-Jewish relations in the Iberian Peninsula. And I was working in the later 15th century in particular, and became very interested in this question of really how plural societies really fall apart as they did in 15th and 16th century Spain. And this broadened my perspective to the wider Mediterranean to ask questions not only how plural societies function more or less, but also how and why and when they fall apart. So I became very interested in these kind of sociological and anthropological perspectives. And quite early in my teaching career began thinking of these things. Back in 1988, as I was telling Professor Esposito, I taught a course at Notre Dame where I first began teaching on Islam in the West, from the Prophet to the Iranian Revolution, and then moving to Toronto, where the student body was, much more diverse. I began teaching, Mediterranean history, specifically along with Spanish history, and saw, the great interest that students have in this field, precisely because it enabled students to engage with some very big issues like interfaith, interethnic relations, histories of of colonialism and even post-colonialism. We can even talk about that, you know, in the pre-modern period. Questions of intellectual transmission and borrowing, so forth and so on. So a lot of questions that seem to address issues that students were grappling with today. But the timing of it was, of course, you know, Brian, Tom, and I kind of putting our heads together and realizing that it was a great time to do it for two reasons. Number one, it just seemed that in terms of the way the academic world was moving, student interest, professorial interests, there just seemed to be a great interest in the kind of themes that we were grappling with in terms of Mediterranean history. So there was that. And also for me, when I first began teaching Mediterranean history, it was very, very difficult to put such a course together. But after a while, there was a certain critical mass of scholarship on both the Western Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, the Islamic world, the Christian world, the Jewish world, that enabled this kind of project, I think, to take off more effectively. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for those comments. And now over to Tom Burman.
Yes, thank you. My interest in the Mediterranean began, though I maybe didn't recognize it, way back when I was first studying medieval history, which I first did in the kind of standard medieval history course that focused on the European peninsula of Eurasia, and which focused primarily on England, France, and Germany, a little bit of Italy, and the Crusader states. And I have very, very vivid memories of coming across things that happened in the Mediterranean that kind of had to be mentioned in this course, but which were kind of more interesting than the whole course was. For example, the fact that all of these texts of Greek science, medicine, philosophy were translated into Arabic, you know, somewhere in the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And then later on, many of these texts, along with all of the Arab reflections on them, Ibn Rushd commentaries on them, were translated into Latin in Iberia. And I kind of wanted to stop the course and say, wait a second, let's think about the amazing thing that has just been described here, this transference of knowledge between two different linguistic groups, two different religions, replicated later on in the Iberian Peninsula. And ever since then, I've wanted to make those things that seemed like that were fascinating fringe elements in the traditional Western European medieval course into the center of the course itself, which means moving the focus to the Mediterranean, where it turns out that such areas as Baghdad and Basra in the early Middle Ages, and Toledo and other cities in Iberia had long been places where people of the three different faiths lived side by side for generations and generations. And it was that made possible this massive transference of ideas and technologies from one part of the Mediterranean to the other. And being able to set up courses in which I could make that the center of the narrative, first by teaching the history of Spain, then by teaching the history of the Mediterranean, became the thing I wanted to do more than anything else. And Mark and I had begun talking about doing a textbook, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, Mark, but it really got underway when Brian said he wanted to do this and helped galvanize the other two of us into action. So yeah, for me, it was a matter of putting at the center these tremendously fascinating things that were on the periphery, and which I'm so delighted to be able to participate in a project that brings them into the center of the narrative rather than pushing them to the side.
Great. Thank you for those comments. Brian?
Okay, well, let me share my screen just to put a little bit of imagery up here. I hope everyone can see that. Thanks everyone for coming to listen to us today. I guess I'll say a couple words too about how I found myself here in the middle of the Mediterranean, and then I'll take a couple extra minutes because I just want to give the audience, in case they're not familiar with it, a little overview of the book, so they'll have a better idea of what we're talking about. So the books are The Sea in the Middle, The Mediterranean World, 650 to 1650, and an accompanying source reader, Text from the Middle. And what the book really does is it recenters the history of the West. You know, traditionally, and I don't mean we necessarily, all of us, but as the Academy, we think of the West as being Western European, Northwestern European culture and society. And, you know, we've really kind of refocused the West, the pre-modern West, thinking more in terms of an Abrahamic world, which stretches more or less from the Indus River to the Atlantic, and which gradually over the centuries sort of expanded deep into sub-Saharan Africa and into the north of Europe. So it's sort of a matter of changing one's perspective on a historical narrative and bringing together two narratives, really European and Islamic history, or even European or Western European, Byzantine and Islamic history, bringing them together in a new narrative. As far as how I got here, I'd have to say the turning point for me was after my BA. I found myself quite improbably studying Arabic in Aleppo with a private tutor, and living in a society which I found fascinating, because it was at once so riven by different ethnic and religious cleavages, but somehow it also all worked as well. And that just fascinated me, because I'm interested in people more than texts. And when I started my graduate work at Toronto, I was interested in the experience of minorities, religious minorities living in the Middle Ages. And I wound up looking at two groups, Mudéjars, which is Muslims living under Christian rule in medieval Spain, and Coptic Christians in Fatimid Egypt. And I expected to find two very different situations, because one was in, the Catholic world and one was in the Islamic world. And I found that on a kind of functional level, there wasn't really much difference between their experiences in terms of their opportunities or vulnerabilities and the vicissitudes of history. I think the main difference was that because Islam has this concept of dhimma, which is kind of institutionalized, that this Christian minority was able to persist until the present day, whereas, of course, eventually the Muslims were forced to convert in Spain in the 16th century. But aside from that, it was really similar. And that got me thinking, well, if we can, kind of scientifically speaking, if we can cancel out for religious culture in terms of what their experience was, then it must lie in other things. And this led me to the cultural, social, and economic environment of the Mediterranean as what was kind of holding things together and shaping these people's experiences. So, and, that sort of tied in with, I think, a general malaise, which was felt certainly not only by me, but many medievalists who were increasingly training in more than one region. And so we have an intuitively comparative perspective, and the old narratives just didn't make sense to us anymore. Someone like Tom could look at the intellectual history of the West and see that you can't section off European intellectual history, because so much of it was entangled with what was going on in the Islamic world. So this is the kind of perspective we're coming from. And I don't want to ramble on about myself, but I do want to talk just a little bit to give you an overview of the book. So bear with me for a couple of minutes before we get to the questions, and I'll give you an overview. So we have the two books, The Sea in the Middle, Text from the Middle. And one of the interesting things is the chronology we chose. It's not the standard chronology from the Middle Ages. And you can see that in a way, it's really informed by Islamic history, because our book begins around 650 with the beginning of the Islamic expansion. And we have our first period goes through the period of, let's say, the three caliphates, Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid, and a certain corresponding period with the Byzantine Empire, right? Around 1050, we have the effects of pretty serious climate change and environmental crises, which contribute to the sort of the collapse of this caliphal imperial world. And we have our next period when peoples from the periphery of this quote unquote civilized or Abrahamic Mediterranean start coming in, attracted by the wealth and dynamism of it, seeking to fill that political vacuum that has been left by the collapse of these large state structures, right? And then 1350, we get another punctuation, which is tied, again, coincidentally to environmental issues. We have the whole issue of the Black Death and again, a changing climate that lead us to our third period, which is the contest from the Mediterranean, where we see larger imperial bodies kind of reconstituting themselves, notably the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, but also, of course, the French and Northwest Africa, once again, sort of competing for dominance of this central geographic zone until, by 1650, really the Mediterranean in many ways has lost its protagonism. The age of discoveries has opened up new routes for Europeans, and the Mediterranean ceases to be the epicenter of political, economic, and cultural dynamism in the West, we might say. But just quickly to the book to show you how these chapters break down. The chapters combine chronology and thematics, right? So we're not presenting an exhaustive history of all the kings and princes of the Mediterranean, which would be both impossible and absurd. We focus on what we consider to be key themes. Themes revolving around conflict, around collaboration, transculturation, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, if you go through the chapters, what you'll see is, for example, we don't have a chapter on the Crusades, right? The Crusades are just another episode, just another manifestation of dynamics, which we can see, manifesting in many different ways across this period. In terms of the book itself and using it, we're really lucky because the press was very, very generous in terms of illustrations, which we think are really important because we really wanted to bring this period to life. And illustrations are important because they convey the integration of these different cultural, social, political groups in ways that text just doesn't do. So we have wonderful maps, and you'll notice one of the things we didn't put on the maps is border lines, okay? Because you can't put border lines on maps of the pre-modern world because, power structures were not so rigidly defined. So we have our maps, and then, as I said, we really have wonderful color illustrations. I think there's 140 or so color illustrations that we were able to work into the book, tying directly to the sorts of themes that we discuss in the text. And then before I finish with the book, I want to, with the textbook, one of the more innovative things that we've done in the book is, in addition to presenting a sort of analytical narrative, each chapter is punctuated by what we call artifacts. And artifacts can be any number of things. They can be texts, primary texts, such as this one compares the Pact of Omar with the Treaty of Tudmir in Spain. Sometimes they're cities, right? Sometimes they're buildings. Sometimes they're objects. Again, cities, different types of objects, ideas, and technological items, and so on and so forth. And what these do is they provide a little sort of illustration for the students or a little case study for the students to latch onto, which exemplifies the larger themes of the chapter. So it gives them something tangible to get a grasp on. Now, just before I stop, I'll only take about 2 more minutes. I just want to talk a little bit about the reader because it's pretty interesting as well. When we set up the reader, the sources integrate directly with themes that we discuss in the chapters. But one of the innovative things I did was, we're all experienced teachers and we know how students are today. So instead of giving them long excerpts of primary source materials, we decided to find really short excerpts that could be read if necessary in class. And we like to juxtapose different sources coming from different cultural and social contexts together so that the students can make new connections. And I'll just give you one example of these. And this is from one of Tom's chapters, I think, and this is Learning Medicine, Finding Medicines. So for the source reader, we have a short introduction, and then we have a series of short texts. Here, for example, an excerpt from Ibn Sina's poem on medicine. Then we have a Latin translation of the alphabet of Galen. And then we have a Judo-Syriac medical fragment. And finally, a Byzantine commentator on Dioscorides. And then we have a few questions that the students can kind of ruminate on. So the students are drawn into this diverse, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic world. And they sort of are forced to make the connections themselves between these texts and these cultures. So the reason why I think that one of the reasons why the book works is because this view of the West that we present, which shows the integration of the Islamic and Christian world and Muslim, Christian, and Jewish thought and culture, is something that the students understand intuitively. Our students now in North America, they come from diverse backgrounds. They're, many of them are children of immigrants, or they come from families that combine different traditions. So for them, it's quite natural. And in my experience now, having taught the book in 2 courses, the students find it a view of the Middle Ages, which is both understandable and relevant to them. And I think that's important. So I'll stop there. I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover for the book. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Let me just begin with a couple of questions. Why do you think there's a need for a textbook like this now? I think that's always a question when books are published. Very often, there are times when books are published or not published because publishers wind up saying, we don't see a market there, or, there's no need. So it'd be useful to have your perspective on that.
I can jump in.
Yeah, well, I'm unmuted. Yes, I'll just say a couple of things about it. One, I think that that as Mark and Brian have both implied, we live in a world where a kind of a Middle Ages that is much more diverse, and that is a Middle Ages where religious action and conflict is at the center, is a lot more relevant to our students than is a kind of a deeply Latin Catholic Middle Ages with a few Jews in there, which is the way the old narrative worked. Our students experience these kinds of things in their daily lives, and they're of course in the news all of the time right now. So in a way, a textbook that focuses on the medieval Mediterranean is a way of looking at questions that the globalized world of the modern period brings to the foreground in a period 1,000 or more years ago as well. It's this great laboratory we have of exploring at a distance, and doing so at a distance is often very important. It takes some of the charge off these questions. It gives us this laboratory where we can think through a lot of these same issues that are pressing for our students and the broader society right now. And I think the second thing I would say is, and I think Mark implied this earlier as well, I think the time had come from a scholarly point of view as well. I don't know that this book could have been written 30 years ago, but in the decades since, there have been a fair number of scholars who, often like some of us, in rather geeky books intended for other scholars, have explored a lot of these dynamics, have crossed the traditional boundaries between these 3 civilizations, and begun to think through what are the issues of this world of frontiers, and had provided, therefore, a foundation in the scholarly world upon which we could build a narrative intended for a much broader audience. So I think the time was right for both of those reasons. But I'm sure my colleagues have things to add.
Yeah, would anyone else like to comment on it? Or I'll move on to another question if you like.
I would just say that it's also the way that scholars are trained now. You know, a lot of the people doing the most interesting work are people who have, you know, instead of focusing on the Islamic world or Jewish history or the Christian Middle Ages, have trained themselves often in response to, you know, the sort of increasingly competitive job market in more than one area of specialization. And as a result of this, they've been naturally kind of starting to draw the same sort of connections and conclusions that we have. So it's, as I said, it's really sort of an organic movement, I think, that we've arrived here. Yeah.
I would just say that as somebody who's taught for many years, it really is a book, you know, whose time has come and is needed. When I first saw it, you know, it just said to me that in addition to it being terrific for students, it's particularly also good for teachers, because unless one has the kind of perspectives that you three bring with overlapping but different backgrounds, it puts a tremendous burden, given the absence of that material, when one is doing a course, for example, on that begins by talking about maybe in the title the Islamic world, but then given what you'd have to pull together, you know, for students to even begin to read, you know, and so, you know, at a time when for many of us, I hate to admit this, but I buy books like mad. But one of the questions is, when do I get the time to read them, you know? And, you know, this is just a book that definitely I see, and I see it also as filling a tremendous need and enabling me to teach a course that I might not have been able to feel that I could teach and pull the material together. You know, I wondered, and I think those that are watching would probably be interested in, you know, were there specific challenges that you faced in trying to, you know, craft this kind of narrative? Yeah.
I think one challenge is that there is kind of an imbalance in the historiography. And this is partly because of a very different source base that one has for the Islamic world as opposed to Byzantium or Latin Christendom. And for Latin Christendom, one simply has, especially from the year 1000 on, a lot more archival sources that lend themselves to a kind of more detailed sort of social an anthropological historical approach, whereas sources for the Muslim world are less, archival sources are far less abundant. And so when we're trying to craft this narrative and give a certain kind of balance to it, one finds that, you know, whereas we have, you know, very detailed sources about, you know, lower class women in, you know, in late medieval Italy or something like that, we don't necessarily have, you know, the same kind of things for the Muslim world, for instance. And so trying to craft a narrative with balance where we have appropriate examples for each of the societies we're trying to deal with, I think that presented a kind of challenge for me anyway, as I was putting the chapters together. That's one thing.
Yeah, I would say another challenge, at least for me, was trying to figure out, you know, what I had to leave out, because there's just so many interesting things happening and just so many fantastic examples and anecdotes and episodes that it required all of my intellectual self-discipline to keep my chapters within the within the prescribed page limit, because there was always, you know, another example I wanted to give or another story. There was just you know, so much to say. So that was my challenge.
I wonder.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's so much material, and I keep finding more stuff, even in the relatively short period since we've written about it. For example, there's all this really fascinating work going on right now about the so-called Coptic Renaissance in the 13th and early 14th century, this explosion of writing in Arabic by Coptic intellectuals. And I happen to be reading it right now for some other work I'm doing, and I keep thinking, why didn't we put that in the textbook? So yeah, it was very difficult to narrow things down.
I wonder, was there anything that surprised you as authors as you were writing the book?
I'll tell you what surprised me. It wasn't so much when I was writing, because I was more focused on the chapters on which I was responsible for, although we all had input, but teaching it has been a revelation to me, because I keep seeing connections that, I wouldn't ordinarily see. Like, for example, was Mark, who was sort of in charge of the more early modern period, and reading, for example, about the development of the sort of political Sufism in the Ottoman Empire, and all of its sort of wacky manifestations. First of all, when I teach it, it gets me thinking about the hippies. So that's how I explain it to my students. But then you can see similar things happening on the other side of the Mediterranean, in Habsburg Spain, as it's kind of clamping down, right? The gypsies, Roma, start becoming an issue, and people are joining the Roma who aren't Roma. So in a way, it's kind of like a similar sort of reaction to an increasing rigidity on the part of the state. And how on earth would you see those connections unless you're looking at a narrative which is constructed in this way that kind of invites you in to see these phenomena that otherwise you might regard as completely unrelated, and you can think, wow, there's a reason why this is happening at the same time. For me, it continues to be, reading and teaching the book, a revelation.
Andrew, why don't we go to the questions from other?
Excellent. Yes, we do have some questions here. So again, hi, my name is Andrew. We're with the Alwaleed Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. If you do have a question, please submit your questions into the Q&A section, and they will be read as they come in. Their first section, the question we have here is from Robin Reich. Robin asks, what informed your decision, collectively I'm assuming, to begin essentially with the start of Islam, rather than including some of the Jahiliyyah and late Roman Empire that informs the structures and intellectual foundations of the early Middle Ages?
I'll start.
Why don't you jump in, Mark? Brian. No, you go ahead, Brian.
No, please go ahead.
I would just say, first of all, you have to start somewhere, right? Because otherwise we'd be talking about, the Sassanids and the ancient Greeks. But I think that, for us, really the defining moment, or the sort of, the beginning of this era, to the extent that one can, draw a firm line on any chronology, is the cultural and religious hegemony of the Abrahamic faiths in this region, right? And that is something that really happens with the rise of Islam, right? We see the kind of, one doesn't want to, speak in too overly dramatic or, chronologically informed terms, but really this wipes away the last of late antiquity, in a way, and we're entering into a new age. And we thought that was a good point to start. We hint at some of the antecedents in the introduction, but you have to draw a line somewhere. And for us, this periodization made sense, right? This is laying the foundations for this new, what do we call it, this Helleno-Islamic Mediterranean. You could say Perso-Helleno-Islamic, I guess, but so that's kind of why we start there.
I guess for me, it was also a little bit of a playful iconoclasm, maybe, in the sense that the way I was taught medieval history, one begins with the early Middle Ages and the conversion of Western Europe to Christianity. And it's very much, for the most part, Northern European centered, with the exception of the development of papacy and papal institutions in Rome. And to sort of decenter that narrative and talk about the conversion of the Mediterranean from a sort of Romano, sort of Christian, lake, so to speak, into a largely Muslim one and Byzantine one was interesting to me, because it just, well, I say is it decenters the narrative, and not to reduce the importance of the papacy too much, because it's needless to say, it's a crucial institution that developed over the course of the Middle Ages. But in that early medieval period, sometimes you see the popes kind of waving their hand saying, well, what about me, in comparison to the Byzantine emperor or Muslim or Muslim caliphs and so forth. So I just thought it was to me, it seemed like a really good way of reminding readers that, this really is a different narrative of Mediterranean history. But again, as Brian says, it was mainly, you got to start somewhere, because one could do all the Roman and Christian antecedents, but then we're back to first century.
Well, and I think the decision that accompanied it, which was to go up into the middle of the 17th century, had a lot to do with the date we chose to begin. 1,000 years is plenty of history to cover, and it was kind of iconoclastic to cover the period from 650 to 1650, but in many ways it makes a lot of sense. The Mediterranean we're talking about is a Mediterranean of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, so it made sense to start there. It also did something else I think is really important, and something that really, after many, many years of working on these issues, I really kind of thought about for the first time, which is, the great story of religious transformation in many ways in the medieval period is this massive conversion to Islam that happens relatively slowly at first and then with greater speed later on. But I think we all too rarely think about that. And this book really makes us focus on that. And Mark, I think, really brought that to my attention in parts of the book that he wrote that really focused on conversion to Islam. And I think that's a story that really needs to be told, and that our students need to know about, rather than the sort of the traditional focus just on the conversion to Christianity in Latin Europe.
All right, we do have a couple questions here from attendees. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and submit it, and you can also submit it anonymously by checking a box if that should be what you want to do. So we have a question here from a Catholic University of America PhD student, Saeed Kamaki. The Ottoman authors from the late 16th century defined a turning point in history, a revolutionary change, and something novel happening in their time, threatening order and power. What they have in mind is the nascent military of revolution, with technologies and new state formations brought to Central Europe. What do these changes, what we call early modernity today, happening in Europe and being observed by the Ottomans, fit into your framework of the Mediterranean world?
That's yours, Mark.
Well, I think certainly, you're referring, I think, to some degree to the military revolution that Jeffrey Parker and others have talked about in Europe, and this fits into the whole question of technological and cultural transmission, between West and East, and vice versa, and the so-called competition between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, and that is all certainly in our narrative. But by the same token, and I think this is not news, but Ottomanists in in recent years, for the past a good while, have been challenging this narrative of Ottoman decline and European domination, whether it's technological or commercial, by looking more closely at what was going on in Ottoman societies and within Ottoman commercial networks and so forth. So although yes, we're very alive to those technological and military shifts, I think at the same time we're also, the textbook is also very alive to the fundamental resiliencies of the societies involved, so that when we're talking about the so-called decline of the Ottoman Empire, or even the diminishing importance of global importance of the Mediterranean as a center as an economic and political center, we're seeing these changes as very, very gradual, as these indeed were. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question completely, but I think it all deals with this question of how we understand relative balances of power, Mediterranean versus Atlantic, Ottoman Ottoman/Islamic versus Western European.
Yeah, I just underscore that, at least my sense, when I was being trained in the material that was out there, a lot of it was just always very dualistic or bifurcated, and so one was looking at Christian history and that got emphasized, or one was looking at Islamic history and that got emphasized, rather than bringing it together. And the same thing occurred when it had to do with the spreads of empires and the fall of empire. So, for many people, they would talk about the flourishing of Islam up through the Abbasids, as if then everything ended. And then, of course, people would note that, well, there was an Ottoman Empire, but even there, never really emphasized enough how incredibly rich it was politically, culturally, etc. And it always became necessary, at least as I saw a good deal of the history, to always act as if when an empire was not as strong and as maybe it was, that it was over, and then therefore you get Europe steps in, and so that, and then even when you sometimes deal with students, their sense is, well, why should I be studying, some of this stuff in the past that disappeared, and not realizing that, the significance actually, of seeing it, in this way.
Well, certainly, if I could, if I could jump in, we wanted to get away from this old model of translatio, I think, studi imperii, the idea that, culture is this football that the Greeks pass to the, the Arabs, and the Arabs run with it and they pass it to Latin Europe. It's this constant multivalent, polyvalent process of communication that knits together the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish worlds of the Mediterranean, and to not take that perspective is really, you're fighting against the sources if you do that. But for example, another point, there's two ways to teach the crusade. You can teach the crusades the old way, which is that these Christian knights came down and waged holy war against the Muslims in the Near East, and the Muslims kind of galvanized themselves and fought back, and then we have the line moving back and forth on the map between the red zone and the green zone, right? But the other way to teach it is to actually look what was happening, right? And you see that the Kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, was in a codependent relationship with Damascus, or that Antioch was allied with Aleppo, right? And they're joining against each other, joining with each other to fight against Byzantium or against their neighboring Muslim or Christian states, right? And if you leave that out, then you're not teaching history, you're teaching a cartoon, essentially. And we're not interested in that. And we think that our students and certainly our colleagues are intelligent enough to appreciate that those narratives and those perspectives just don't hold anymore. We move past them, and what we want to do is provide a tool. And going back, just if I could, to your earlier point, John, one of our goals was, it's intimidating having to teach a course on the Mediterranean, having to integrate Jewish, Christian, Islamic history, this long period. So all we wanted to do was, because we couldn't be exhaustive, is give instructors a base in which they could feel comfortable and confident that they could teach the contours of this history. And it invites them then to emphasize their own areas of specialization through that process. So,
yeah, I think of the bifurcated kind of question and answer that would occur, like, for example, who started the Crusades and then who won the Crusades? And I go back to my own education, both grammar school, high school. It was Catholic education until I went for a PhD, and the perception of the Crusades, how they began and how they ended, was totally different. And I found that when I first taught students, particularly my first job was at Holy Cross, and I taught students, many of them had a total Catholic education. Many of them were stunned, and I knew their initial reaction would be not to want to believe the complicated situation that would have to be described as to, why the Christians got involved, why the Pope got involved, how, and then who kind of, at the end of the day, was it a clear kind of, slam dunk in terms of who won historically, etc. And I think the fact that you have now, as with some other areas that you're covering, that you have a single volume, that covers it, and I must say, for those that have not seen the book, it is very substantial. It's a very heavy book. I wound up trying to carry 3 copies of that book home along with some other stuff, and I can tell you, and that's what makes you feel confident, though, about the book. At least, you feel like there's going to be lots of material there, and not simply, a quick, neat, this is it. Here's, here's the, the easy answer. Well, Andrew, let's go to another question.
Okay, we have a question here from Jack Owens. Jack says, when I created a course at NYU in the early 70s, I started in 500 CE to get Justinian into the book. I wanted to talk through the course to 1700 CE about visions of law and judicial administration as a basis of political action, social movement. How do you handle these perspectives in the 3 periods that you discuss in this book?
That's a hot potato. I'll leave that for Tom and Mark.
Mark's the right one to answer this one.
Well, I don't know about that.
How lucky you are, Mark.
If I understand it correctly, it's a question about the relationship between law and social action. In terms of Justinian, of course, his influence in terms of, Western and Byzantine, legal history was huge. And of course, reemerges in significant ways, in the 11th and 12th century, university schools, and informs, of course, continental legal procedure and the like. But I think for us, if we're looking at this question of law and its relation to social practice, social reality, I think what one sees in our book is well, on the one hand, a lot of continuity. If we're looking at the Islamic world and the legal structure and all the legal discussions surrounding dhimma, the contract of protection, as was understood, protection of minorities, just how you might say sturdy that the dhimma was, throughout the period we're dealing with. And I think Brian mentioned this earlier on, but the absence of something like Dhimma, the more sort of ad hoc legal adjustments that Western monarchs and even the Catholic Church made to the presence of minorities simply were not strong enough to inhibit the kind of great transformations and ultimate illumination of most minorities that took place in Western Europe. Another interesting thing about the relationship between law and social practice and social reality, if we're talking about interfaith relations, is just that how consistently, again, throughout the period we're dealing with, although the laws would have all kinds of proscriptions and prescriptions about what minorities, adherents of minority and majority faiths could and could not do, whether it's in the sexual realm or in the economic realm and so forth. How often, and one guesses this from the iteration of many of these regulations over time, how often they were not observed, which is to say that despite what the law books say, people on the ground in their individual communities had their own ways of dealing with things. So I don't know if that's, I think, I could go on to talk about law and violence and all this kind of thing, but I'll leave it at that.
I'll just jump in and say, if we had started at Justinian, you could ask the question, why didn't we start at Constantine? And I think, as Mark is saying, I think a number of historians have really pointed out that the development of Dhimma and this particular way of segmenting power and identity in a complex, diverse society, which ultimately was a Sassanid borrowing. So, we should go back to the Sassanids, I suppose, was in many ways, for the kinds of questions we're interested in, was really transformative, because it set the groundwork for all of the interactions, whether these are intellectual, social, political, economic, that are going to come in the region. So, for us, it was a good starting point. Now, that doesn't mean when you use the book that you can't teach the antecedents. We invite you to do that. And, if the publisher would give us more pages, perhaps we could do a chapter on that. But, the beauty of a piece of musical composition is not just the notes, it's the silence between the notes. So, we leave that for our readers and our instructors to fill in.
Great. Andrew.
We have a question here from Alessandra. Thank you, everyone, for your work. Follow-up question about Justinian. I wonder if you considered starting the narrative a little earlier in late antiquity, at times in which the cultural and religious fluidities were enhanced, for example, by the establishment of a new urban axis represented by the foundation of Catlos.
What I just said.
Yeah, I
got it.
I mean, I guess we would say, yeah, we considered all of those things. We considered various beginning points, various ending points. At some point, when you write a book, you have to make some decisions that in some ways seem arbitrary. I don't think ours were that arbitrary, actually. I think it made a lot of sense to begin with the rise of Islam and the amazing transformation that brought about. And as Brian said, instructors we really expect that instructors will bring to this project of teaching the Mediterranean their own expertise and fill out areas that we don't go into, supplement what we do. There's a lot, to use Brian's analogy, there's a lot more silence than notes in our textbook, given how much ground it covers. So yeah, there's a lot of empty space to fill in.
All right, we do have a couple questions here. This one is from an anonymous attendee. It says, you mentioned technology in your book as an indicator or precipitator of social and societal change. Does your book account for how the sharing of technology is or is not tied to the sharing of religious or cultural ideologies in the period you cover?
Well, yeah, I'll say a few things about that. I think, first of all, we certainly cover the transference of technology, and we cover in a variety of ways the sharing of religious ideas, even religious ideologies, reading each other's religious texts, interacting through religious debates and exchanges of letters and that kind of thing. We don't really anywhere bring those two areas together under the same lens, I don't think. I think that one of the reasons we might not have done that is that I think we would all agree, I mean, speaking of I and my two co-authors, that yes, religious identity did make a lot of difference at points, but at other points it didn't make that much difference. And it's important to see that things like the sharing of technology happened in part because people were perfectly willing to put off their religious identities in order to learn how to do things like make paper, a technology that traveled all the way across the Mediterranean, learned first by Muslim artisans from Buddhist artisans in the far east part of the Islamic world, coming all the way to the West, becoming a major industry in newly conquered Valencia, for example, where Christian artisans learned from Muslim artisans how to make paper, and making paper is a really difficult, complicated process. And I think we would prefer to see that as a moment when religion didn't really matter all that much. What mattered is, here's a really useful technology. We'll learn it from whoever we can, we find who can share it with us. At other points, of course, religion did matter, and people did try to convince each other to convert from one faith to another. They did shout at each other in moments of religious tension, and got into active violence with each other, moments of religious tension. But I think, as I say, I think we all are very adamant about the fact that religion matters up until the point when it doesn't. And it's surprising how quickly it cannot matter that much.
And I would just jump in and say, you know, the ethos and the method of the book is not necessarily to explicitly convey all of these things, but, you know, we'll show you an astrolabe made in Toledo in the 11th century that has Hebrew, Latin, and Arabic characters on it, right? And we'll invite you to consider, or the student to consider, well, what does that mean in terms of religious culture and how these religious cultures were interacting? Or something like the multilingual calendar of Cordoba, you know, a 10th century almanac written in Latin and Arabic with Hebrew characters, and which combines different calendar systems and contains Christian saints and folklore. So, you know, these connections come out, they're there in front of you. And I think it makes it more powerful when you draw these conclusions yourself.
And
Go ahead,
I
Mark.
would just add, sorry, I would just add to that, I guess, and say that, you know, as Brian and Tom are suggesting, is to sort of illuminate, but without being so explicit about it, some of the fundamental paradoxes, you know, in interfaith relations. And it's kind of fascinating when you think about it, that many of the, you know, Arabic texts and technologies that that Latin Christians, you know, acquired from Muslims were through conquest. And yet, when you look at the writings of, you know, Western, you know, scientists, physicians, mathematicians, and the like, who are so fascinated with these Arabic texts, or who just kind of matter-of-factly, you know, adopt, you know, these new technologies, the sense that, you know, these texts came from, you know, so-called enemies is pretty well absent. And, you know, how to explain these kinds of, you know, mental leaps that these scholars made, or that kings made when they were very conscious that, if we're acquiring, X irrigation system or X system of, making pottery, we're fostering this, that this came from, the Muslims whom we have just conquered, and doing this, not seeing any, kind of problem in it at all. Whereas in other areas, perhaps say more theological and philosophical areas, there would be more of a concern. But it's these kinds of paradoxes that I think should raise a lot of discussion among students.
The amazing thing is not even necessarily, though, because if you look at something like theology, you have the Latin scholastics, binging on Ibn Rushd quite openly. The commentator, Dante can't bring himself to put the guy in hell, even though he's a Muslim, right? So this is the incredible thing, even in the context of theology, because all of these people knew that at bottom, they're working on a pagan foundation, all of them, right? Which is a cause of no small anxiety either. So, yeah.
It's a great point.
So we have a couple more questions. Here's a question. This is a different kind of question. So anonymous attendee asks, there seems to be a trend now in some Western countries to see an examination of historic events, specifically events critical of colonial powers at large, as, quote, dangerous or disturbing. Would any of you care to speak on the importance of introducing young people to history as it was, and the trend of banning certain history texts from K through 12 schools?
Well, our textbook might well be banned at certain. we haven't come across that yet. We are actually here at Notre Dame and the Institute I direct. We teach a course collectively at one of the local high schools called Why the Middle Ages Matter, and we use our textbook for it. So far, there's been no pushback from that. But I think again, I'll dare to speak for my co-authors that we are all in agreement that part of the job of historians always is to make students at least a little bit uncomfortable. That if we don't do that, we're not really doing the job of being historians, and putting in front of students texts, and this has to be done with nuance and carefully, but texts that they might find shocking, and is what historians do, among other things. And we're certainly opposed to the notion of not teaching some kinds of history because they feel too dangerous. Not to say that these issues don't have to be handled carefully, but I would say we all think it's our job to do so.
On the other hand, go ahead, Mark.
No, please, Brian, you go. I'll go after you.
I would say, on the other hand, two things you won't find in our book are moralizing and nostalgia. All right. We try to present things warts and all. So no one gets a free pass. This isn't a book that looks back to some golden age of, intercommunal harmony or something like this. The constants are there. There's a constant background of violence to all history, including this history. So our perspective is, if you're looking for a golden age, talk to the people that have the gold. For the rest of the people, it's probably not that golden. And I think that insulates us a little bit because, to the extent that we all have some sort of political or moral agenda, but I think that we don't let that warp the perspective of our book, and we try to be as open as possible. There's no good guys or bad guys in this history, I think.
Yeah, and I would just follow on what Brian is saying by, pointing out that, one of the beauties of teaching in an area like the Mediterranean, you see across the board, whether talking about Muslim societies or Christian societies, similar phenomena. So if we're talking about, histories of, we're not using critical race theory in the book, but there certainly is structures of discrimination that religious minorities in both societies dealt with. If we're talking about histories of colonialism, it's not simply the antecedents of European colonialism in the Middle East and South and East Asia. The Muslim conquests and Muslim colonization of the regions they conquered also brought about similar kind of political and social phenomena. And it's bracing and really useful for students to think about history in this way, to see that at the end of the day, certain people suffer more at different times, but at the end of the day, similar political and social processes are going on. I mean, I teach an undergraduate course. It's a global history of violence from prehistory to the present, and it's uncomfortable as heck for the students. But one of the points of the course is that we human beings throughout history have dealt with certain situations, respond in very similar ways, unfortunately, if we're talking about the history of violence and so forth, but that this is as a teaching process, as a learning process, I think really useful for students, especially in the kind of classrooms we have now that are so incredibly diverse.
If I could make one little follow-up on that, I would just push even further, and I'd say it can make you really uncomfortable because, for example, you look at these structures of discrimination and segregation, which are part of the package of pre-modern diversity in the Mediterranean, right? And you find that at times the minority communities or their leaders are actually advocates of these structures because they see them as the only way of preserving themselves. So, it's very difficult to apply a sort of modern moral perspective coming from where we do to these societies. And so, it really, it makes you think about things and makes your students think about things in ways that perhaps they hadn't considered before, and which goes, as John was saying, it goes beyond a lot of these dichotomies and binaries that are, were inculcated with in our, earlier educations.
So I think we may have time for one more question, I think. Professor, what do you think? A couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
All right, we have one more question here from an anonymous attendee. The attendee says, thank you so much. I was wondering if you all could speak about how bringing these diverse or nuanced perspectives and stories around this time period in particular into the classroom might impact student perceptions or understandings of present-day Mediterranean geopolitics or U.S. foreign policies or politics.
Well, I'll step in again. I think we've chatted among ourselves over the years of working on this book that we all feel a little bit of a obligation to bring this world of the Mediterranean to modern readers, in part to help instill a much more nuanced view of exactly this kind of matter of how one part of the modern dichotomy, the supposed dichotomy of the sort of West and the Islamic world, can or ought to act. I often think that what I'm doing in teaching this material is showing students that, yes, the history of Christian, Muslim, Jewish relations is in part a history of violence, but it's also a history of a lot of other things as well, alongside that violence. And often these things are more persistent than the violence is itself. That the medieval past, the Mediterranean past, shows us that, in fact, unlike what many people in the modern world on various sides would say, Christians and Muslims and Jews can, in fact, live side by side with a relatively high amount of peace for long periods of time, can interact with each other regularly in the marketplace, can interact with each other as scholars and intellectuals, can go to each other's religious services, and we have a lot of evidence of that kind of thing happening, join in each other's festivities. We don't have to assume the way a lot of, too many people, I think we all agree, do that Christian-Muslim relations boils down simply to violence. And I say that partly because I don't know if I could count the number of times I've talked to other sort of well-educated people in North America who are doctors and lawyers, and we get to chatting about what we do. And I say, I'm a scholar of Christian-Muslim relations. And they say, oh, that must all be about blood, isn't it? Isn't it all about violence? And these are people who have, really solid educations. And so I think I at least feel very strongly that that's one of the things we're trying to accomplish with this book, is to use the past to help us remember and relearn that violence is not the total of this interrelationship.
The analogy I like to draw is you can think of the Mediterranean as a region characterized by religious violence and conflict, the same way that you can think of California as a state characterized by a lot of seismic activity and destructive earthquakes. But you can live in California for years without experiencing one of these destructive earthquakes, right? So they happen, right? It's part of the environment, but it doesn't necessarily at all characterize people's lived experience or their daily experience, and they may never experience it. Although when it happens, it can be transformative and destructive. So it's a matter of a shifting perspective. If you look for something, you're going to find it. And that's why we try to include as broad a perspective as we can in this book, so that, as I was saying, we don't hit the students or the readers over the head with any of the points we're trying to make about either acculturation or violence. It comes out, I think, in a subtle way.
It's always been fascinating to me in a lot of, not just the teaching, but the public talks, the presumptions that people have of one faith towards other faiths. So if you're talking about violence, if you're talking about attitudes towards sex, if you're talking about minority rights, they will criticize another religion, but they won't look at their own. If you say that, for example, that you had great conversions, let's say, to Islam, the presumption will always be those were forced, but that same Christian would be offended if you said, did that ever occur with the Christians? Did that ever occur with Christian missionaries? Depending on what missionary, what time period, we're talking to. And so, and as you said, these can be very, the observations sometimes can come from very well-educated also professionals, but who, as one said to me just recently, when he realized what I did, and he said, well, I mean, probably Islam is not a completely violent religion, right? And I thought, and I think that it's one thing when you get it from let's say some students initially, although it's changed a lot. I mean, the education that students get now as compared to when I first started to teach, but where it always really gets me is when I'm actually dealing with people who are academics. So, they can't just say, well, sometimes people want to say, well, physicians, they just know what they do, in terms of physicians, but they really have never studied history of the liberal arts. But you get it from academics. It'll be, a statement that it boggles your mind that they still have that belief, and that if you go to respond in a way to enlighten, they will draw the conclusion that you either don't know what you're talking about, or perhaps you're a convert yourself and you just don't want to admit it. But anyway, we'll move on to the next question.
We have our final question here. Let's see. This question is from Dylan. Dylan asks or says, thank you to the three authors for this exciting resource. When talking about technology sharing, there is a tendency to focus on the usefulness and goodness that accompanies this sharing. Taking a critical eye to the Mediterranean perspective, and the willingness to seek commonality across the Mediterranean time and space. Does this book address any of the social, cultural, or environmental ills that might follow the flow of knowledge and technology, and particularly the impact on pathogen sharing?
It's a very interesting question, and one I really like. And it's a question that I think, wow, in the second edition might be worth us exploring more. To my, as far as I recall, the only place where we discuss some of this is at the end of the book in an epilogue where we do talk about the horrible spread of pathogens to the New World and the enormous destruction of native North and South American communities that resulted from it. But I think we implicitly also deal with the issue when we discuss in various ways how borrowing, say, ideas from one civilization to another or one culture to another can, interestingly enough, lead to the building of even higher walls between them. So as Brian said, all Latin thinkers in the 13th century learned their Aristotle through Ibn Rushd in his commentaries on Aristotle, which they all borrowed from the Islamic world through translation. But then having mastered this Aristotelian view of the world, this Arab Aristotelian view of the world, they then used it to create sophisticated scholastic theology that made it that created a vision of the world that could not include Muslims at all, and that in many ways drew a higher boundary, a taller wall between Islam and the European world than had been there before. But I think that's mostly implicit in the textbook, not explicit.
I mean, we do deal with, the spread of bubonic plague and the so-called Black Death in the mid 14th century and afterward, but and discuss the impact of epidemic disease, on populations in the wider Mediterranean region, as well as the so-called Little Ice Age of the late 16th and early 17th century, which was, a global phenomenon and affected both, Muslim and Christian societies in rather dramatic ways. So we do, draw attention to these phenomenon, but not in quite as explicit a way as the question suggests. But it certainly is something, as Tom points out, worth thinking through more for subsequent editions, hopefully.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm trying to think of how we talk about things like the dissemination of new crops and agricultural techniques. But, it seems to me, and maybe this plays into the chronology too, that, prior to 1650, the impact of man-made technologies on the environment doesn't seem, except for perhaps, through the knock-on effect of, say, the spread of certain pathogens, really is dwarfed by the impact of the sort of non-man-made environmental changes, the medieval optimum, which warmed up and wettened Europe and was the launching pad for the growth of Latin Christian society and economy. Those sorts of things, I think, in the big picture at this period, certainly if we're talking on a regional level, have a far greater impact. After 1650, as the so-called ages of discovery, connect parts of the world directly that had not been connected directly before, maybe that's another sign that we're getting to another era after 1650 in some ways. So, yeah.
Well, I think, Andrew, is that it in terms of the number of questions?
Looks to be the last question, unless you have yourself any questions you'd like to ask our authors.
All right, I think that the one of the the questions would be, and I'm trying to think of how to. It would seem to me that the nature of your book, given the materials that you provide, and documentation, as it were, that you provide, also would make it easier for academics who don't normally touch that area. In other words, this could invite an expansion in the curriculum, in that often many academics are do not have a hold and a really good comparative hold on the period that you're covering, and therefore wouldn't think of teaching that course, introducing it. And it seems to me that the design that you have was aimed at, therefore, not only being, as it were, used by people who are that is from the teaching point of view, who are specialists, but with an expectation that this can be a tool that can get this area into the curriculum in many schools. And I just wondered whether or not that, how much initially you were thinking about that.
My hope is certainly that this would become the new way to teach the Middle Ages, not just the Mediterranean, but the Middle Ages. I just don't think it makes sense unless you're covering very strictly European or Anglo-European questions. I just don't think it makes sense, if you're going to teach the Middle Ages, to teach it just from a European perspective. It would be like teaching the history of the United States from a Texas perspective. It's a fine perspective, but it just doesn't, for me, it doesn't make sense. So that's my secret dream, that this will be the way that people think about the pre-modern period in the West.
I would add that I think Mark and I started talking about this a long time ago, and I know the three of us chatted about it over the years, that the area of Mediterranean studies as an academic area, as an area in which scholars identify with, an area that is has the centrality to it, that people say, I'm a Mediterranean historian. That's something we wanted the textbook to do as well, to help create that field, make it even stronger, because the field in some ways doesn't quite exist without its textbook. And so I think we're hoping, I was hoping to help make this field an even stronger and realer, we might say, academic subject by writing this textbook. Though I certainly agree with Brian that we wanted, in particular, people who didn't feel comfortable teaching this from just a pedagogical point of view, to have a tool that they could use to accomplish that.
I would agree with both, Tom and Brian. Teaching the Mediterranean is enormously difficult. One is dealing with, three religions with its sectarian variants and innumerable shifting, polities and the like. So, making the Mediterranean teachable, was quite a challenge. And yes, there, with the objective of not only enhancing, Mediterranean studies, but also perhaps, making the Mediterranean, narrative of medieval history, the new, medieval history. And, I have a colleague, who's teaching, the textbook now to his students. And as medieval survey, as the straight up medieval history, and he hasn't heard a peep of dissent. And I think one reason for this, of course, is that number one, students aren't coming in to university necessarily with that much historical background, perhaps especially not much medieval historical background, and don't have any prior assumptions about what constitutes, the Middle Ages, geographically or otherwise. Moreover, given the societies in which we live and the problems with which we deal, the Mediterranean, makes perfect, sense to them as medieval history, just as much as the older, or I think more so than the older, narrative focused on, England and northern France and the Italian city-states, made sense to people back in the day. So yeah, it's all very exciting, and one sees it in the classroom all the time, just how dramatically students' perspectives and my younger professorial colleagues, since I'm one of the old guard now, perspectives have changed over the years.
And I would just jump in and say there's no reason, in fact, why you couldn't use this as a supplementary text in an Islamic survey. It's the sort of it's the different side of the same coin. I don't think, depending on how you're focusing your history of the Islamic world class, if it's at all kind of westward looking, then it's the same thing. You can't leave out this part of the story because it's integral to the larger processes that gave rise to the shape that the Islamic world took. So
no, I agree. This is really, for me, this is from a teaching point of view and a historical point of view. I think it's a groundbreaking book. I feel awkward talking this way because I usually, when I run these kind of program, I don't get this enthusiastic. And I want to make it clear, I have not written yet to ask for a share of the royalties. But I think that this has been a great program. We record the program, and then it will be distributed on all of our, both ACMCU, the Alwaleed Center, but also our project, the Bridge Initiative, on our Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to thank the three of you for the book, but I especially want to thank the three of you for spending time with us and making this as fascinating a program as it has been.
Thanks for having us. It was great to be here, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate your interest, and we're really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much, and a pleasure again to meet you, Dr. Esposito. And again, thanks for all the participants in their wonderful and challenging questions.
Take care.
What those guys said, yeah, I'm in full agreement.